Hi guys. Tonight we're stepping into a world so grim that even the ghosts are taking notes. The world of Victorian mourning etiquette. That's right. We're diving into a period where every day was a literal funeral, and the biggest social faux pas was showing up to an event wearing something other than black. So before you get comfy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment sharing your favourite black clothing accessory, or maybe reminisce about the time you accidentally dressed like you were attending a funeral instead of your friend's wedding. Now dim those lights, crank that fan for some soothing white noise, and settle in, because you're about to embark on a journey into the whimsically morbid lives of Victorians. Have you ever wondered why mourning was a full-time job? Did people really wear black for 2 years? What was the best way to dispose of your deceased pet goldfish in a socially acceptable manner? Could you survive a dinner party where everything revolves around dead relatives and macabre stories? And now, congratulations, you've just been transported to Victorian England, where it's always raining, everyone's in black, and finding a proper handkerchief to dab your tears might be your greatest challenge. In Victorian England, death wasn't merely a part of life. It was life. The society was so fixated on mortality that it practically set up camp outside the cemetery. From melodramatic mourning to elaborate funeral rituals, these folks could really turn a pre-game for a shindig into a wake faster than you can say, ripped black lace. With the rise of death as a social event, it was almost customary for Victorians to have an entire death calendar, a sort of grim version of a social planner, where appointments with the grave were as frequent as Sunday tea. Picture it. You're throwing a lavish gathering to celebrate the life of your great-aunt Ethel, and what's the dress code? Black lace, of course, and not just a simple black dress, no, it requires crinoline, capes, and enough veiling to obscure your face, as if obscuring your face might erase the mortal coil of it all. These were not casual affairs. A proper Victorian funeral could rival a royal wedding, the only difference being the absence of a cake and the presence of a coffin that would give any modern DIY enthusiast nightmares. And don't even get me started on the funeral directors of the time. They were more than just professionals. They were like the sad, supernatural event planners of their day. Funeral homes looked more like a scene straight from an Edgar Allan Poe poem, with floor-to-ceiling drapery and velvet-lined coffins so ornate they could double as elaborate, gloomy coffee tables. You want it to really pop? The ironic phrase might have been suggested. How about a skull motif with golden trim? Talk about over the top, but attending these funerals was practically mandatory. Imagine being at a dinner party where everyone but you is recounting tales of the deceased, while you sit nervously chewing on a tiny biscuit, calculating how long it will take before you're expected to share your own ghost story. The pressure was palpable. If you didn't shed a proper tear, tongues would wag, and you could easily earn yourself the title of Heartless Hester for your supposed indifference. So, you learn quickly, the art of shedding a tear can be as finely tuned as the skill of flipping pancakes. Death also mingled beautifully and awkwardly with the daily lives of the living. For the Victorians, visiting a botanical garden picked out with funeral themes was as common as a stroll through your local park today. Yes, you read that right. There were even death flowers. Flowers, mind you, were less about the beauty of nature and more about the appropriate way to signify sorry for your loss. Want to send a message? A bouquet of lilies would say it all, as would a sweet-scented bouquet of forget-me-nots. Ever wondered why you'd receive flowers at a funeral? Now you know. No flower was too grimly poetic for the occasion, so prepare yourself for a mountain of blooms. Adding to the complexity of mourning was what could be dubbed as death rolls for men and women. When male family members passed away, women often wore their mourning attire for up to 2 years, while men were expected to grieve for a fraction of that time. It was as if grief was socially engineered into bite-sized pieces for men. Perhaps they got to wear the stylish mourning coat, an odd cross between a tuxedo and a cloak of sadness, dictated by the codes of social standing, which might not have been so different from a Victorian superhero outfit. But of all the societal oddities, the most bewildering had to be the popularity of mourning photography. This is where the lines between macabre and mortuary blur so significantly, you're left questioning reality. Families would pose next to their deceased loved ones, cradling the stiff cadaver as if it were a fussy baby or something to flick through at a family reunion, complete with props and all. And there it was, that one image you could hang over the mantelpiece, proudly showcasing little Charles next to Grandma who passed last Tuesday. That's right. Memories with a capital M were born out of an unsettling blend of Victorian melancholy and the lens of a camera. Ultimately, the Victorian obsession with death crafted a curious culture revolving around mourning, a blend of spectacle and sincerity that could surely put our modern grief practices to shame. And as they mourned in their elaborately draped black garments, there was one thing the Victorians agreed on. When it came to death, make it charmingly dramatic. After all, they believed life was but a dress rehearsal for a final act, so why not pull out all the stops? Let's talk fashion, or as the Victorians might call it. How not to look like you just had a wedding while your great-uncle Harold still stinks of last week's embalming. Black was the colour of choice, and the more layers, the better. Think of it as the original layering trend, but instead of looking chic, you look like a funeral tent. The mourning attire of the era was so expansive and elaborate that even a modestly shaped person could appear 4 times their size. Are you feeling a little chilly? Toss on another lace-trimmed layer or two. It was a struggle to even take a seat without the risk of getting tangled in your hoops, or accidentally suffocating yourself while reaching for the last scone at tea time. Now let's discuss the various fabrics that adorned the morose masses. From silk to velvet, these materials were like wearing a heavy emotional blanket, sometimes literally, as the Victorians had a penchant for keeping their feelings close to their hearts and a chilly breeze inside their garments. A typical mourning dress could weigh as much as a small child, draping elegantly over your frame while simultaneously announcing to the world that you were in deep sorrow. This was not just formal negligence. No, it was mourning etiquette. If you didn't look like you were engulfed in a cloud of sadness, what would your neighbours think? That you weren't really grieving? Blasphemy! You might wonder, how did one accessorise such an outfit? Well, nothing says, "I'm heartbroken," like a stunning piece of mourning jewellery, which was essentially an invitation to public pity. Brooches made of jet, yes, dead coal dust turned chic, became all the rage. Think of them as the perfect companion to go with your dramatic outfits and puzzled expressions. Would you want to wear something that hangs over your heart as if it was former martini-related baggage? Absolutely. Because the Victorians took pride in the accompanied melodrama as much as they did in fashion itself. Let's not forget about the headgear. If your ensemble didn't include an elaborate black bonnet or a veiled hat that could obscure your face entirely, were you even mourning properly? These accessories did more than enhance the outfit. They provided a literal shade to hide behind as you sniffled, ensured that if someone dared to greet you prematurely with a cheery, "good day," you could merely swoop your veil and retreat from the world like a pro. Being spotted smiling in your bonnet could lead to social ostracism faster than you can say, "blushing bride." And there were rules, strict, unforgiving rules about colours. Black was required for respectable mourning, and should you dare to introduce grey or lavender too soon? Well, that was the equivalent of arriving to a funeral in a Hawaiian shirt. After all, how could you express heartache without being draped in enough fabric to warrant the making of a small funeral home? Slipping in a splash of colour was not an option, unless you wanted people to think you were celebrating a life lost, not grieving it. What was next? telling a joke about Uncle Harold. The horror! Now what happens when the time passes and mourning fashions evolve? Enter the stages of grief, quite literally, with designated mourning attire for each phase. The first year demanded full-on black, of course, while years 2 and 3 permitted the introduction of muted tones. Eventually you could daintily flirt with colours that suggested you were finally on the mend, while still reminding everyone that those darling shades of grey were an ode to your beloved who left you in tatters. Victorian garb set the stage not just for acts of mourning, but also for keeping society on its toes about who was allowed to grieve how long and in what fashion. After all, the ultimate goal of the Victorian mourning dress was to ensure that everyone surrounding you was always aware of your misfortunes and sympathised accordingly. Whether it meant coordinating your outfits with your social calendar, or simply ensuring that your layers told an eloquent tale of woe, the fine art of dressing for despair was just part of modern life in those gloomy, black-clad times. So the next time you opt for your minimalist wardrobe, remember the weight of the past, literally and fashionably. Ah, the sweet simplicity of modern fashion. A blessing for sure, but can it compete with all that extravagant style drama? The jury's still out on that one, at least until the next royal scandal. Who says grief can't be glamorous? The Victorians wore mourning jewellery as if it were going out of style. Oh wait, it was, because they were just that serious about mourning. Ready to turn your tear-filled memories into an exquisite brooch. Just don't forget to send an RSVP to the afterlife. In the blink of an eye, or perhaps one teary blink, mourning jewellery became essential to a proper expression of sorrow. Not only did it serve as a reminder of the dearly departed, but it also loudly proclaimed your dedication to relentless grieving. Forget understated accessories. These pieces were bold statements, adorned with hair, pearls, and even the occasional bit of coloured enamel in case folks wanted to show they were still vaguely in touch with the living. Imagine attending a Victorian gathering, dressed head to toe in your finest black. Look down at the exquisitely crafted black jet necklace resting heavily against your neck. Each bead seems to sigh heavier than your own heart, as if mourning with you. Each swirl of craftsmanship is an intricate story of woe. People would glance at your neck, nod appreciatively and say, "Ah yes, she must be suffering the loss of someone very dear." Or maybe they'd just admire your style, oblivious to the heartache it symbolises. She manages to look fabulous even while crying, they'd think, and honestly that was the whole point. Let's be real. In a world of endless drudgery and rain-soaked streets, who wouldn't want to glamorise their misery? And now, let's dive into the fascinating world of hair jewellery. Yes, that's right. Hair. Victorians often took strands of their dearly departed's locks and wove them into elaborate designs. Why? Because nothing says "I miss you" quite like a lovely locket entwined with hair that may or may not still smell like whatever the poor soul had for lunch last Tuesday. What a statement piece. Oh darling, is that an exquisite bracelet you're wearing? Why yes, it's encased in the hair of my late great-uncle Aside, who accidentally sat on a tuffet during his tea party. These pieces weren't just fashion statements, they were heartfelt reminders that morbid can also be meaningful. Just imagine your friends gathering round at a social event, eyes watering at the sight of you wearing a vintage brooch, Model 35, marked with a sweet memento of Uncle Ed. Oh, how lovely, darling, they'd coo, knowing you were really just one minor social faux pas away from honouring him in the most dramatic way possible. You know, someone would start, fishing for conversation while trying to avoid the actual topic of grief. That reminds me of Cousin Margaret. She left us just last winter. Poor dear. But look at you, turning this all into art. It's practically a conversation starter. As if that weren't enough, There were entire art movements dedicated to creating attractive death symbols, jewellery fashioned in the shape of tombstones, and skulls turned you into a walking grief manifesto. Can you picture it? You walk into a lavish gathering, bedecked in attire blacker than the memories that haunt your heart, and you're adorned with a ring fashioned from sombre material shaped like a crypt. Nothing screams, "I'm stylish while mourning for you," quite like a miniature gravestone dangling from your earlobe. "That looks heavy," someone might remark. "Not as heavy as my heart," you'd reply, summoning your inner Victorian divinity. And then came the sweet sensation of getting these glamorous baubles. Think about it. You didn't just waltz into your local jewellery shop and pick a piece off the rack. No, Victorian jewellery was all custom-made, hand-painted and hand-carved. Artisans would labour over these precious trinkets, pouring sorrow into every detail. One ring might have taken days, if not weeks, and you had to be patient. After all, good grief takes time. Ultimately, mourning jewellery was about more than the lovely aesthetics. It was about elevating tragedy into a form of cultural expression. It was a way to say, "I loved deeply and am now utterly devastated." It's like having a diploma in mourning hanging on your neck or wrist. So the next time you find yourself in a black ensemble for a funeral, remember the Victorians not only mourned, they adorned their grief in style. Wouldn't we all like to carry our heartbreak with a sprinkle of glitz and glamour? Just when you thought Victorian aesthetics couldn't get darker, enter post-mortem photography. Yes, that's right. These lovely folks immortalised their dearly departed with a delightful snapshot, as if saying, "It's not enough to remember you, I need a photo for my mantelpiece." Imagine a time when funerals doubled as family photo ops, where mourning wasn't just an emotional state but an entire photo shoot theme. In Victorian England, the camera became a morbid yet oddly charming tool for preserving memories, placing deceased loved ones in striking poses that would make model agencies weep. Picture this. You gather your multi-generational family. Great Aunt Mildred, who's been knitting in the corner, will surely come back to haunt you, if not captured in the frame, and set up a lovely backdrop featuring floral arrangements meant to signal both grief and nostalgia. But wait. The star of the show is lying a tad lifelessly on a plush sofa, carefully arranged with the same care that one would dedicate to a living family pet posing for Instagram. Now, that is what we call a family reunion with a twist. Are spiders considered a decoration if you spin webs around the dearly departed? We all know the answer here. Well, to them, definitely yes. These post-mortem portraits range from the surprisingly serene to the downright peculiar. Some families went for the full-on eerie effect, propping their dearly departed up as if they were merely taking a nap. As if to say, "Don't mind Grandma, she's just had a long day binge-watching the afterlife." The aim was to portray them in their best and most natural light. Coupled with floral arrangements and the occasional pet, these photos became artifacts of love, acceptance, and double doses of denial. Can you imagine flipping through the family album at a reunion and casually encountering a picture of Uncle Freddie forever destined to stare blankly back at you? Talk about a conversation starter. Everyone would need a distraction. Furthermore, these photographs didn't simply signify loss. They were also a means of connection. Families would don black attire, gather in a heartfelt display of unity before the camera, and guarantee that Uncle Charlie's very serious expression would forever remind them of just how much he hated family photos even in death. Bonus points for creativity if you managed to sneak in a bright red flower in memory of his favourite, spice rack accident. Staring at the image, you can almost hear the melancholic chuckles trapped in the shadows, as if Grandpa Milburn somehow managed to grin from the beyond. Or perhaps he just thought of something transcendently humorous. Sorrowful portraits often took on artistic flair too. Some parents would dress their deceased children in bright, lively clothing, oblivious to the fact that they would end up in an album torn between sheer tragedy and morbid curiosity. That's right. What better way to cope than to create a vibrant tribute to the tyke, one that would perfectly contrast the ocean of dull black around? Of course, it's essential to capture their spirit, right? Little Clara always loved daisies might just be code for it's too late now, might as well create a Pinterest board of memories. And let's not overlook the photographers themselves, masters of their craft, who took on the challenge of death as a profession. They wielded their cameras like wands, coaxing the recently departed into perfect poses that would make even the most stubborn model burst into a smile or a haunting glare. Hold still, Mrs. Thompson. Just one more meandering sigh, please. It wasn't just about snapping a pic. There was an art form to be mastered akin to painting the Mona Lisa, except the subject never smiled, never posed, and, not to state the obvious, was excruciatingly still. But herein lies a fine line between celebrating life and romanticising death. As cheerful as it seems to look back and chuckle, there's an undeniable somberness surrounding these images as well. A reminder of mortality that lingered in the hearts of families, an ever-present backdrop to their lives. Today, post-mortem photography evokes a bizarre cocktail of emotions: curiosity, reverence, disbelief, and, let's not forget, a whisper of dark humour. It's perfect for showing how Victorian legacies danced on the tightrope between celebrating life and embracing the chilling permanence of death. In summary, these Victorian memorial snapshots were far more than simply a bid farewell. They were an invitation into a realm where the line between the living and the dead blurred. Who knew that capturing grief could serve such a curious social purpose? It might not be the kind of album you'd want to brag about on social media, but hey, death is an art form after all. So, the next time you pick up your phone to take a picture, remember the twisted legacy of post-mortem photography. Smile, because, well, that's a few generations away from being in the family photo. Forget pubs and tea houses. The local cemetery was the place to be seen. Friends gathered to awkwardly sip tea in black dresses while sharing whispers about the latest grave-digging gossip. If you weren't buried 3 feet deep, you were barely in the ground. Just imagine, instead of grabbing brunch with mimosas, you're out at the cemetery, brushing green thumbprints off your mourning attire while you sip lukewarm tea from a china cup. It's a real Victorian vibe, complete with the occasional wandering bee trying to figure out if it too has lost its way in this eerie social scene. As you stroll through the graves, you might hear one friend report that Lady Hennypenny had finally decided to settle into her plot and stop complaining about unsettled finances. Was her mausoleum really made of granite, or just overcooked bread from the nearby bakery? Nothing adds a splash of scandal like inappropriate kitchen gossip at an open grave. And let's not forget the fashion stakes. Each visit to the cemetery required careful coordination of the latest mourning attire. Layers of black lace, oppressive silks, and hats so large they could double as umbrellas for the entire family. Who would dare show up in yesterday's black? Fashion faux pas gauze you some serious social side-eye from other mourners. And speaking of gossip, let's not forget the subtleties of funeral fashion. You could size up your social standing based entirely on your mourning attire. A top hat with a tasteful purple band for the gentleman meant you were absolutely in on the social game, while a widow's weeds for the ladies indicated that even death had to pass muster with the latest fashion trends. Nothing screams, "I'm grieving" authentically quite like ensuring your taffeta doesn't clash with the granite of your loved one's headstone. Heaven forbid you walk past a particularly judgmental local tailor who's likely cataloguing your grief outfits with a bespoke tape measure. Cemeteries were not just the final resting places. No, these hallowed grounds were the prime social networks of Victorian times, Think Instagram, but less about selfies and more about sepulchres. Pairs of friends would discuss the latest obituaries that could rival any scandalous novel. Did you hear about Mr. Browning? Sent to a better place, through the window, not the door of the ball. It was a full-circle life event, a community event that took keeping up with the Joneses to a whole new level. And those headstones, they doubled as social markers, telling everyone who had died and what kind of legacy they left. Did the inscription say, "Lovely soul," or "Kick the dog at least thrice a week"? Walking through these graveyards was a fine art. One misstep, and you may just find yourself accidentally standing on the resting place of someone who didn't have the good fortune of having a bench to rest upon. And that's a faux pas that surely wouldn't be forgotten. At least not until the next burial a week later. Let's not delve into if they were resting peacefully or attending to a rather loud plaque that insists you can rest with dignity, despite the recent addition of crossbones. With the ever-present risk of an accidental disturbance, social etiquette demanded that mourners tread with no less care than that of a ballet dancer, further ensuring that at least some drama was guaranteed. The less than impressed mausoleum occupants were probably gearing up for a complaint to the heavens about the racket these living folks were making while they tried to catch up on their eternal slumber. And just in case the ghosts decided they had reached their social limit, the living mourners would depart, carefully traipsing back through the hallowed grounds, ensuring not to step on anyone's toes, or rather, tombstones. Eventually, bodies and tears were the currency here. Just ask any of the mourners how they could escape the reality of life, all wrapped up in morbid curiosity. Care to join us next week? Someone would ask enticingly. We're holding a tea party by poor old Gerald's grave. Rumour has it he was actually propped up on pillows at the end. Can you believe it? One could only hope the tea was stronger than the scents of aging roses and wilting sadness surrounding them. Because when life gets dreary, you find joy in shared tales of the dearly departed. It's time to explore how these folks turned sadness into art. Forget straightforward eulogies. Victorians turned their loved ones into epic tales, penning obituaries that read more like tragic poetry than a list of life achievements. Because when it comes to grief, why not make it a drama? These mournfully creative souls lavished more words on their deceased than some authors used to write entire novels. In a world where robust emotions were bottled up like expensive perfume and released only at funerals, the obituary emerged as the ultimate stage for their theatrical proclamations. Imagine receiving a handwritten notice announcing the passing of your neighbour, Mr. Grimsby. You'd expect a simple, "He died. Sorry for your loss." No, you're greeted with a heartfelt manuscript that begins, "In the sobering dawn of Tuesday, as the sun struggled to pierce the veil of sorrow, our beloved Mr. Grimsby passed from this earthly realm to join the ethereal choral of angels." You can almost hear the violins playing in the background, can't you? Victorians had a flair for the dramatic in all aspects of life, and death was no exception. Their etiquette manuals were filled with guidelines for composition, dictating that humour and brevity were as welcome as a leaky umbrella at a picnic. Consider the importance of resounding phrases. What about a euphemism like, "He was seized by the cold grip of death," instead of just saying, "he died"? Because let's face it, who wants to sound mundane when you can leave everyone gently sobbing in a state of reflective melancholy? A good Victorian obituary required substance, heart, and quite possibly a thesaurus. It was like a battle of wit and sorrow. Mentioning the dearly departed's love for gardening, better include how they cultivated the earth with unparalleled devotion. And if they ever owned a parrot, the obituary must mention how it was the silent guardian of a precious spirit now free. You weren't just mourning a person, you were crafting an epic saga about their life, or as close to one as you could get without accidentally venturing into the realm of absurdity. Of course, the social clout also played a significant role. The power of the living loomed larger than the departed in these morbidly enchanting tales. Those who could pen sorrowful nothings with extravagance had the upper hand, and if you came from a family with impressive lineage, well, your chances of receiving a glowing tribute skyrocketed. An obituary could make up for a less than stellar life, shaping a narrative that dripped with grotesque romanticism. Oh, the heckles they received in life! One could imagine peers whispering as tears trickled down their cheeks, barely faking a sense of despair. But let's not forget the strongest social currency in this elaborate scheme: the ability to be the next best grieving friend. The amount of words sulking in your group of mourning buddies dictated your status. It was less about how much you cared for the deceased, and more about how flourished your tribute was in a society eager to outdo itself at every turn. If your obituary didn't make others weep into their handkerchiefs, did you even love them? And what about those who met strange ends? Old Mrs. Crumpet, who tragically expired whilst wrestling with a rogue tea kettle. Cue the frenzy of wordplay. Her spirit slipped from this mortal coil, leaving behind the faint aroma of Earl Grey and a kettle left perilously unguarded. Beyond mere lamentation, this dramatization transformed life events into stories fit for the most tragic of Shakespearean characters. The mere act of writing these obituaries encapsulated the essence of Victorian society, a group that embraced sorrow like a well-tailored suit. If you didn't spew out some theatrical elegy for your beloved Aunt Gertrude, it was as if she had never existed. Talk about pressure. This was the era where every moment could be a stage, and death provided the most extravagant performance of them all. So, the next time you send your heartfelt thoughts and prayers, texts, or hastily scribble your condolences in a greying greeting card, spare a moment for the fine art of Victorian mourning. After all, they truly knew how to turn loss into a masterclass in dramatic flair, reminding us that, when it comes to grief, it's not the length of the obituary that matters, it's the poetry that lingers on. Want to make a career out of being grieved? Welcome to Victorian mourning rituals. From wearing black for an eternity to conducting ceremonies so elaborate they could rival a Broadway production, mourning was a full-time gig. If you loved your dearly departed, you better be prepared for the long haul. That's right. You could practically start a side hustle as a professional mourner, complete with your own portfolio of tears shed and memories honoured. This was no mere weekend hobby. This was your vocation, brandishing a black-edged calling card that read, "Grieving is an art, darling." So how did one go about this tedious yet rather glamorous job of mourning? It all began with the clothes. Picture this: a wardrobe entirely dedicated to pining away in sumptuous black garb, each layer meant to convey just how broken-hearted you were. You'd start with a rustling black silk dress, layering on shrouds and veils until you looked like a frightful wedding cake made for a particularly morose occasion. Forget wearing bright colours in the presence of death. You might as well be spotted wearing a neon sign that screams, "Look at my love life choices!" And let's not forget about accessories. Nothing says "I'm devastated" quite like a pearl-studded black headpiece that could evoke an overwhelming sense of dread in even the cheeriest of mortals. Now, once you've mastered the attire, it's off to the mourning rituals, which could be as intricate as your Aunt Geraldine getting ready for a ball. If that ball had only one guest, the Grim Reaper. One of the most delightful, and by delightful, I mean appalling, rituals was the wake. This event featured a viewing of the deceased, preferably in a living room that reeked of grief and stale biscuits. Friends and family would gather, dressed head to toe in their black best while discussing the latest gossip. Yes, even during death. "Oh, Gerald, did you hear about poor Martha? She was devoured by a badger last week, can you imagine? But wait, it gets better. The mourners weren't merely there for the ambience. They participated in rituals that required expert coordination, like the solemn walking procession to the graveyard. You'd best be ready for a march so laborious and dreary it could rival any funeral scene in a Gothic novel. Imagine the sombre tolling of bells leading the way, accompanied by the mournful wails of friends who've decided to enter their grief phase, like it's a dramatic play they'd better win an award for. And just when you thought it was over, oh no! The mourning phase wasn't merely a few days of fare. In fact, some ladies were expected to don their black attire for years. Yes, years. That's right. You might as well move into your mourning dress, rearranging your entire life around it. Your morning coffee? Black. Your afternoon tea? Black. And your social life? Well, that's gotten a bit darker as well, because friends would melt, away quicker than ice cream on a hot day. You could either join a mourning society complete with secret handshakes and weekly meetings, or succumb to the grief depression of your empty social calendar. However, the Victorians were nothing if not creative. To spice things up, they often included elaborate ghost stories during mourning gatherings, because after all, nothing screams let's celebrate life, like tales of unspeakable horrors from beyond the grave. You'd be regaled with stories of apparitions joined at the hip to your aging great-grandmother, or the rumour going around that Uncle Eddie's ghost really did haunt the fridge for a glass of vintage milk he never claimed. And it wouldn't be Victorian mourning without a sprinkling of spiritualism, of course. Yes, the craze for speaking to the dead reached fever pitch around this era. Decked out in layers of black laces and finger-wagging, you'd sit in grand parlours, quaking in your shoes as the resident medium communicates with Aunt Beatrice to tell you which pie recipe would get you the best turned-up noses at the next potluck. Who needs family recipes when your uncle's ghost can send a signal from the afterlife? Mourning rituals weren't just sad. They were a mix of performance art, community bonding, and a full-on roller coaster of emotions. It was a relentless journey filled with colds, social obligations, and the chance of catching some rather juicy gossip, all while commemorating those who kicked the proverbial bucket. So dust off that smoky but elegant black dress. It's time to transform mourning into a lifelong career. In the twisted logic of Victorian life, where death thrived at the heart of social life, you couldn't just mourn, you had to mourn with flair. Because why blend in with the gloomy when you could dramatically stand out with an exquisite sorrow? Losing someone is hard enough without society telling you what and how to feel. Victorian rules for grief were so strict, you almost felt guilty if you accidentally smiled. "Oh dear, you must still be in shock," the neighbours would murmur, as if life shouldn't go on. After a loss, it was expected that you would wear black for about 2 years, which sounds as joy-filled as wearing a sandwich board that reads, "I'm completely heartbroken and totally uncomfortable." Because let's face it, in the Victorian age, grief wasn't just a feeling. It was an official status and a lengthy contract with fine print you were expected to adhere to religiously. In fact, if you weren't swathed in black crepe, you were practically a social pariah. Honestly, wearing elaborate shawls, veils and hats made of mourning attire must have felt like a never-ending audition for an overly dramatic soap opera. It was all about turning your personal heartache into a public showcase. Imagine walking into a crowded room and having to suppress a laugh because the last thing anyone wanted to hear was a giggle cutting through the symphony of sobs. "There goes Mrs. Thompson," someone would whisper. "She must be well over her late husband if she tries to crack a smile. How scandalous." But here's where it gets even more absurd. Not only were you expected to mourn, but you had to do it visibly and meticulously. Maybe you lost your hamster. Oh no, you'd better not just toss a tear into a tissue and call it a day. Instead, your family would expect nothing less than a full mourning service, complete with a tiny casket made of reclaimed walnut and a floral arrangement that could rival a royal wedding. Yes, even your fur baby wasn't escaping Victorian protocols. They believed in honouring every passing as if it were the high funeral of an esteemed aristocrat. Before the clock struck midnight on the final day of an official mourning period, some might even start dabbling in the dark art of spirit communication as a coping mechanism. Ah yes, the séance, where the only thing worse than losing someone is talking to their ghost, while your well-meaning friends pester you for the scoop on the whole ethereal encounter. Was that a cold breeze? Perhaps it was Aunt Mildred's spirit judging your fanciful new curtains. The rules of mourning were designed to showcase your grief as a badge of honour, but it often morphed into a measurement of social worthiness. Each widow and widower was confronted with a 2-year-long "Are you still heartbroken?" quiz. There were points awarded for the number of weeps in public and the severity of your hopeless stare. "Ah, look at that," friends would say, watching you ebb and flow like the tide of a sombre sea. "He's mourning, but is it sincere enough? A 6 out of 10, not quite in the depths of despair." Let's not forget funerals, those lavishly morbid parties filled with tearful guests and a buffet table that looked suspiciously like a family reunion where everyone all wore black. Neat rows of mourners sat together, clutching tear-stained handkerchiefs and swapping ghost stories like badges of honour. Guess who also cried at the last funeral? The elusive Mrs. Jenkins. One could practically imagine the gossip following you like a dark cloud, questioning whether your grief was genuine or simply a social performance. And let's talk about card-carrying mourners. Society encouraged everybody to send condolence cards adorned with black borders and elaborate fonts that would embarrass Shakespeare himself. You'd find yourself sifting through a pile of elegantly scripted notes, each signed with heartfelt messages that all said, "I'm sorry for your loss," but with an underlying tone that felt more like, "Don't you dare forget about me, you're grieving socialite." One might effectively accumulate a backlog of sympathy cards that looked suspiciously like a birthday-to-death spectrum chart. The emphasis on lengthy mourning didn't just add pressure, it transformed grief into an elaborate social performance art piece. You willed yourself to be sad, hands clasped tightly, in dresses so voluminous that it was reminiscent of a Victorian wedding dress gone tragically wrong. Imagine dinner parties filled with shuffling feet, awkward photo-op-style glances, and the dread of someone asking, "So, how do you feel?" That's when the fun really began. All things considered, the grieving process in Victorian England was less about finding peace, and more like starring in an inexplicably long and sorrowful play without a script, where every critical moment strangely felt judged by the audience against some ambiguous standards of sorrow. So, be wary if you find yourself wandering into a Victorian funeral. Don't let a laugh slip, or you might just end up in the spectral corner of neighbours whispering about Mr. Smith's inadequate mourning. The weight of eternity was truly the here and now, and there was no escaping the judgment of a society that grieved fervently and solely in black. Speaking of life after death, the Victorians were keen on making contact. Channeling spirits became quite the pastime, and let's just say that if you were a ghost, you'd better be prepared to answer questions about your social status in what could be the world's longest séance. You see, during the Victorian era, it was more than just a fascination with the afterlife. It was practically a social movement. Ghosts were not just ethereal beings to ward off or fear. They were celebrities of the otherworldly realm. Being deceased was trending, and the living wanted in on the action. Imagine for a moment the hustle and bustle of a Victorian parlour, adorned in ominous black drapery with flickering candles casting spooky shadows across the walls. Guests gather around a lovingly repurposed piece of furniture, such as an old dining table, and brace themselves for the impending supernatural drama. Instead of appetizers, The only enticements were cold turkey sandwiches and a well-brewed cup of spirit tea. Alas, the only thing closer than your next-door neighbour's stale bread was their eager anticipation of contact with the great beyond. Will Aunt Gertrude's ghost reveal the winning lottery numbers? Please don't say my hair gets frizzier in heaven. As the circle formed and hands were clasped, the real entertainment began. Mediums were the headlining acts of these ghostly get-togethers, seamlessly transforming ordinary parlours into makeshift portals to the afterlife. With an air of dramatic flair and a wardrobe that shone with shadows, they would channel spirits like it was an Olympic sport, minus the gold medals and plus a heaping dose of the theatrical. "Oh, my dear friends," they would declare, their eyes rolling back as if staging the most dramatic fainting spell. "I sense a presence. It's an ancestor. Or maybe it's Uncle Fred. He borrowed my book and never returned it." Of course, the spirits had a way of turning the tables. One moment, you think you're speaking with Great Aunt Ethel, and the next you're hit with an unexpected revelation from a 14th century nobleman who had a grudge against your family for who knows what. Picture this. You ask, "Is there anything you want us to know?" And suddenly, you're trapped in a 45-minute monologue about feudal rights and how your family's love for pottage doomed all future generations to a life of culinary despair. And let's not forget those classic Victorian artefacts such as Ouija boards, also known as talking boards, that were crafted for fun rather than spiritual discussions. They were the original interactive toys that allowed even the most sceptical individual to clutch a planchette and begrudgingly wonder if yes or no was going to result in the ghost of Grandma Gladys yelling at them for taking the last biscuit. "Oh, pardon me. Did this board just spell out my Wi-Fi password? No? Okay, back to the spirit realm." But it wasn't all eerie giggles and imaginative encounters. The Victorian obsession with spiritualism also coincided with a lot of loss, as the era was marred by wars, diseases and urban squalor. So when grief met the search for answers, it created an irresistible cocktail of desperation and curiosity. Many families found solace in the belief that they could still engage with the ones they've lost, as if chatting over tea while reliving fond memories of tenants unceremoniously haunting the hallways. As if the widespread embrace of the supernatural wasn't enough, spiritualist churches began popping up like dandelions in spring. They offered a communal space for the grieving to share their experiences, much like a modern-day support group, but with more unexplainable flickering lights and less coffee. People were spending their evening sitting cross-legged on the floor, showering their spirits with questions like, "Did you really steal my favourite butcher's knife from the kitchen? Or was it the cat?" However, not everyone was convinced of these ethereal encounters. Skeptics, ever the party poopers, gathered to debunk these living room ghost conventions. Their message? Ghosts were not the social elite of the other world. They were more like that overly enthusiastic uncle who just wouldn't leave. These naysayers would expose the trickery of mediums who waved their hands, beckoning spirits, while stealthily employing a dizzying array of trapdoors and secret compartments. It was basically a Victorian magic act, and they were not afraid to point out the strings as they popped a formaldehyde-scented peppermint in their mouths. And so, while seances entertained the masses, they also caused laughter, tears and confusion. Ghost stories became not just tales for campfire gatherings, but celebrations of life, loss, and the absurd yearning to stay connected, even with the dearly departed floating around in a dimly lit parlour. Victorian life was a performance art where each spirit had their place, their voice, and their charm, so long as they brushed up on etiquette before making an appearance. Just imagine throwing in a ghostly declaration on social media, ghosting since 1847, and still no comment section. In a world where sorrow reigned supreme, Many households had designated mourning rooms. Yes, that's right. A dedicated room to indulge your sadness while binging on life's greatest hits of losses. Call it the most exclusive club in town, minus the fun and plus a lot of tears. These rooms were far more than just simple spaces. They were transformed temples of grief, carefully curated by a society that took mourning as seriously as tea time. If you thought your bathroom was too cramped to hold any emotional depth, wait until you see the Victorian mourning room. Imagine stepping into this darkened chamber, with heavy black curtains suffocating all light and household happiness. The first thing that hits you is the scent. It's a mix of stale air and dried flowers, possibly the very same roses Aunt Mabel was fond of before her recent transition into the afterlife. Everything is meticulously placed. The fainting couch strategically positioned for dramatic displays of sorrow, along with a bevy of lace-trimmed heirloom handkerchiefs, because nothing says, "I'm grieving," quite like a vintage lace handkerchief to soak your tears. It's not just a bathroom tissue alternative, it's practically a badge of honour to be brandishing one from your pocket while you weep dramatically over a faded portrait of Great Aunt Beatrice. Every time you sat down on that fainting couch, you'd likely sink into a sea of past sorrows. Mourners were permitted to display their grief in their most theatrical forms. Crying here wasn't just acceptable, it was encouraged. You'd know you were experiencing true Victorian mourning when seeing relatives faint in unison felt like a well-coordinated family performance. It was practically the Olympics of extreme emotional displays, with points awarded for the most melodramatic tear-soaked wails. The question would arise, how did you earn the right to access this sacred space? Well, you needed a tragic loss, of course, whether it was an uninvited pet hamster's untimely death, a distant cousin no one spoke of, or a neighbour's canary that just dropped dead mid-song. Any tragedy counted. You could even mourn the reputation of a good friendship gone sour, thanks to a poorly timed gossip. As long as you had a reason, you were welcomed with open arms. A typical session in a mourning room featured a slew of visitors piling in like it was a family reunion. Instead of laughter and joyful banter, the atmosphere was charged with melancholic energy. Sometimes, attendees would leave feeling lighter, as if their chunky feelings of sadness had been collectively hefted onto someone else's shoulders. Love fest or emotional relay race? It's hard to tell. As for decor, well, it's a competition to see who could overdo it. Death, after all, called for an intricate milieu. Walls were draped in mourning fabric so thick that they could practically serve as blankets. Mirrors were covered to prevent the spirits of the deceased from lingering too long and apparently from making sure you still looked fabulously tragic. It's possible that the term "more is more" originated from these extravagant mourning rooms, as one could find everything from macabre portraits to urns of ashes displayed prominently, looking rather pleased with themselves. And don't think these mourning rooms were merely for show. They provided solace, albeit a grim one. People would gather and share ingredients for their rich sadness stew. Stories of the dearly departed, the indignant misfortunes of life, and tales of how many extra black veils were in the family wardrobe. Yes, it's like an exclusive networking event for the bereaved, where everyone honed their moaning skills and exchanged etiquette tips on the proper way to look dejected. The noise of muted sobs and whispered confessions served as your soundtrack, complemented by the ticking of an old grandfather clock that only seemed to mock the passage of time. After all, in a mourning room, time stood still, much like the relationship between the dead and their grieving relatives. And when the visitors finally left, with handkerchiefs soaked and faces etched in solemnity, they would gladly leave behind their burdens merged into the sacred walls, ready for the next wave of grief to fill the space yet again. So, whether you returned to the mundane world outside, or simply re-entered your regular daily comforts, always keep the danger of mourning rooms in mind. Their delightful, sad allure may make you want to dive right into that deep pool of sorrow, but remember, it may take a mop to clean up all those emotions later. In the name of decorum, there were rules around everything, including what to say at sympathy dinners. You know, the classic, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Can I interest you in potato salad?" It's a fine line to walk between compassion and culinary confusion. These dinners were like a combination of etiquette class and emotional minefield, and attending one was a rite of passage. You'd gather around the din table, and the air would be thick with a strange mix of sadness and the unmistakable smell of overcooked cabbage. Picture this: a gathering of somber faces peering at you from beneath piles of black fabric, each one trying to outdo the other in grieving gravitas. Never underestimate the power of a good black dress in an emotional competition. If you showed even a flicker of joy, perhaps a smirk at a well-timed joke, you risked being labelled callous or cosily unmoved by the tragedy at hand. And heaven forbid you accidentally chuckled while your mouth was full of slightly rubbery comfort food. You'd forever be the person who couldn't handle a family loss. The table would be lined with dishes that looked, and sometimes tasted, like they had been prepared by a grieving culinary apprentice. There's just something about a sad family gathering that seems to inspire less than ideal cooking choices. Ever had funeral potatoes? That's a dish, if you can call it that generally consists of a bizarre combination of sour cream, cheese, and mystery starches that would lead one to question humanity's collective taste preferences. As your plate fills, guilt settles in. Should you really be indulging when someone just lost Aunt Maud? When you finally sit down to eat, conversations fluctuate between awkward whispers about the dearly departed and the inexplicable urge to complain about the cold food. "Oh, but have you tried the potato salad?" would elicit responses as diverse as the attendees themselves. It's held the family together through so many tragedies. Surely it could heal the wounds of loss, Aunt Edith might fervently declare. You'd nod, very aware that few things can patch emotional bleeding quite like a dollop of creamy starch. At these dinners, the rules of speech become even more convoluted. Conversations were strictly governed by silent agreements, and heaven help you if you strayed into taboo topics. Unapproachable subjects included politics, financial troubles, or any hint of the unfortunate circumstances surrounding Aunt Maud's last moments. You'd need to dance around them like a waltzing pair of hopeful spirits, praying nobody noticed your missteps. "It's just a phase of life," the widow would whisper, seated at the head of the table, her eyes glassy like a curated display of tear-filled marbles. Compounding the post-morning awkwardness was the ritualistic tiptoe through the buffet line, where one fumbled about for the right dish to serve. Do you reach for Aunt Maud's famous Jello salad, consciousness pricking at you like a thornier version of a choose-your-toppings dilemma? But what if that had been the 6-month-long bane of Maud's existence? Or worse, the recipient of her ultimate despair as she realised she'd accidentally put too much wasabi in last week's attempt at exotic culinary fusion. Decisions at sympathy dinners were more fraught with magnitude than actual life and death moments. Ultimately, these soirees served as a grand example of life's absurdities, a paradox where sorrow met soup, and grief came served with a side of mashed potatoes. You'd elbow your way through conversations, pretending to care while battling a losing war against overcooked carrots, and overly perky family members who wanted to share amusing, read inappropriate anecdotes about the deceased. Remember when Maud tried to bake her own wedding cake and it literally fell apart like her last marriage? Classic. These sympathy dinners served one overarching purpose, reinforcing the notion that grief was obligatory. There was the unspoken rule that you must suffer through the emotional discomfort while shoveling intergenerationally prepared mystery casserole into your mouth. From awkward first impressions to those infuriatingly circuitous conversations about whether someone had properly mourned, each segment of the evening was layered with the same kind of tension you'd find at a comedy show where nobody laughed. We may never know how such gatherings shaped our understanding of mourning etiquette, but we do know one thing. If you can survive a Victorian sympathy dinner, you can survive anything. If you thought adults had it rough, wait until you hear about the kiddie mourning brigade. Children learned early that grief meant wearing black, and that nothing said, "I'm really sad," like a child tripping over their own shroud at the family gathering. Yes, Victorian parents didn't just teach their children how to tie their shoes, they instructed them on the delicate art of mourning, whether they were ready or not. Children had to adorn themselves in sombre attire that seemed straight out of a Victorian-themed haunted house. Picture them waddling around like unsteady little penguins trapped in plush fabric, their tiny faces solemn as they awkwardly coped with the loss of a beloved pet, or perhaps the favoured grandmother they'd never actually met. Imagine a funeral gathering where kids were handed prayer cards and graveyard etiquette, like it was a playdate activity. Remember, dear, no frolicking by the grave markers. We mustn't disturb the dead, was the casual phrase heard amid the whispers of parental wisdom. Instead of playing tag, they were more likely to engage in a competition for who could recite the most moving epitaph from memory. And if they were particularly morbid, they might even try to decipher the messages hidden within the ornate lettering on the gravestones as if they were ancient runes. Look at that, Lydia. Beloved wife and mother. Sounds so much more poetic than passed away. Do you think she has a favourite biscuit recipe buried with her? Grieving children were not simply allowed to sit in the corner and sulk. Their mourning experiences were exposed to the kind of scrutiny typically reserved for art critiques or high-stakes card games. Keep the tears flowing, but never let the eyeliner run. Children were interior decorators of despair, intricately trained to transform sadness into a fashion statement. Don't forget the special mourning jewellery, mind you. Tiny gold lockets filled with pictures of the deceased became the hottest early accessory and simply screamed, "This person is dead, and I'm on trend." And what was the punishment for failing at mourning? You might think a scolding would suffice, but no. These poor kids were subjected to the ultimate humiliation, being sent to the back of the family coffin wagon during the next funeral procession. Trust me. No child wanted to sit there while the adults held court with nothing but reflections on loss and the occasional spicy gossip about who had the worst cologne at the last funeral. Would it surprise you to learn that Victorian children had their own set of mourning games? You heard that correctly. Funerals weren't complete without a round of guess how they died. Who needed a wild imagination when the possibilities for tragic but educational endings were practically endless? Children would huddle together in hushed tones, recount the most morbid tales they'd heard, each one becoming more exaggerated until the prize for best storyteller was decided, perhaps a tiny melted chocolate coffin or a small toy skeleton. "My great-uncle drowned when he tried to save a cat," little Felix would declare in excitement, and someone would inevitably up the ante. "Well, my aunt lost her head to a chicken." But let's give the kiddie mourners a little credit. They were setting the stage for their own generations of youngsters steeped in an unusual and profound relationship with death. Their laughter and games might seem bizarre in retrospect, but amidst the black lace and sombre tunes, there was a form of playfulness that underlined the shared human experience. Mirth and grief were essentially dance partners at these gatherings, an odd two-step that allowed children to comically and creatively confront something that remained constant in all their lives. Death wasn't going anywhere. Eventually, these mourning rituals transformed into rites of passage. A child who could endure a wake without giggling at the odd-shaped biscuits was seen as one step closer to adulthood. It was as if kids wearing dark frocks and oversized hats were actually playing dress-up in a world where the stakes were decidedly high. Becoming an adult meant learning how to swallow the weight of grief, and one of the first lessons was practicing amidst family and the inevitability of loss. So, the next time you think about the sombre landscape of Victorian mourning, lean in and remember those children. They weren't just mourning in black because it was the style of the time. They were learning how to navigate a world where death was just one more shadow seated at the dining room table, patiently waiting for its turn to be acknowledged in the most absurdly joyful ways they could imagine. For Victorian widows, society might as well have put a giant "Caution Grieving Woman" sign over their heads. Unfortunately, that didn't mean they got special treatment. Rather, they were thrust into a cycle of grief, with rules that made them feel more like black-clad fish in a barrel than free spirits. Widowhood was governed by an intricate web of etiquette designed to keep one's mourning as painfully public and prolonged as possible. Think of it as being given a complimentary lifetime supply of gloom, and a strict dress code to boot. Let's talk fashion, or rather, the emotions it evoked. A widow was expected to don the most fashionable mourning attire that black silk could provide, and the layers could rival a Russian nesting doll. If you thought it was a challenge to find a dress for your cousin's wedding, imagine trying to procure one that signified your undying sorrow. The petticoats alone could smother a person with sadness, yet this was the price of mourning in such an unforgiving society. You could either play the part or risk drawing the ire of lady clutching her handkerchief in the back row, who was always on the lookout for any sign of inappropriate behaviour, like a tear of joy escaping your pale, tear-stained visage. And oh my, the social calendar. There was no respite from obligatory mourning visits. Widows were expected to take a leisurely tour of local cemeteries, pausing at grave sites to weep dramatically. Ah, my dear departed husband, what am I without you? Perhaps a glass of sherry later. The more effort you put into your tears, the more respect you garnered from your peers. It was less about healing and more about growing a reputation for over-the-top grief. Missed a visit? Heaven forbid! You'd be the topic of whispered conversations louder than the church bells ringing for your dearly departed. Your social standing often depended on how long you remained in black, which is a nod to Victorian humour, or the complete absence thereof. If your husband departed like a thief in the night, you'd need to keep up appearances longer than a soap opera. 2 years of heavy mourning was the standard, but some widows took it upon themselves to stretch it indefinitely, perhaps to avoid attending dinner parties where the menu featured anything that wasn't made of sorrow. Oh no, peas! Absolutely not. How could I? My husband loved peas, and I think that would send me into a fit of unseemly laughter. But it didn't end at attire and public weeping. Widows often faced some delightful, eyebrow-raising legalities quite unique to their grim situation. Upon her husband's death, a widow found herself in a precarious position regarding her late husband's estate. If he had, by some stroke of misfortune, neglected to update his will, she was on the slippery slope of financial insecurity. Picture this. In a world without the modern conveniences of insurance and inheritance laws that don't involve a game of rock, paper, scissors, a widow might find herself financially beholden to in-laws or even a long-lost uncle with an attitude problem. Oh, you don't want to inherit his collection of Victorian moustache trimmers? Well, I'll hold on to them for dear life. The whims of relatives were as unpredictable as the English weather. Would you be treated with reverence and offered a piece of his quaint estate? Or would the family lock their coffers tighter than a safe that hasn't been opened since the last revolution? Social events were another horror waiting to unfold for these widows. While they were expected to attend grieving gatherings, conversing over which flower arrangements best represent loss, They also had to endure the insistent matchmaking from nosy family members. Why, darling, you're going to want to get out there again, you know. Couldn't let such a lovely figure go to waste now, could we? Yes, nothing screamed grieving widow like sitting next to a charming gentleman who insists on analysing your taste in black lace while casually flicking through a collection of romantic poetry. In short, once a woman donned the widow's cap, her life transformed into a delicate balancing act of heartbreak and societal expectations. Navigating these intricate rules was akin to playing chess in a torrential downpour. So, hats off to the Victorian widow who grappled with this morbid and confining lifestyle, always remembered for her whispered laments and shrouded presence, but rarely celebrated for her resilience to navigate a life draped in layers of grief. As you sink into your cosy bed tonight, far removed from those mourning traditions, perhaps offer up a silent nod of respect to the women who survived not just the loss of their husbands, but the chains of societal expectations that awaited them, the true unsung heroes dressed in black. Planning a funeral in Victorian times? Better break out your wallet. These events could put a dent in even the wealthiest family's budget. If you thought everything came down to good intentions, think again. In the Victorian world, it was more about the cost of mourning than the kin of the dead. You see, a proper send-off required more than just a heart-wrenching speech and a few tears. It demanded lavish silk drapes, ornate caskets, and florid floral arrangements that could bankrupt an entire village. The higher your social standing, the higher your funeral expenses, which seemed to carry the unspoken rule: outdo the last guy, or risk being haunted by his spirit for eternity. Imagine gathering your friends for a lovely dinner party, only to realise the menu consists of one dish: dead Uncle Hernando's last meal. Your guests would arrive, a polite hush filling the room, because it's considered distasteful to discuss politics or the weather when everyone's thinking about how to outshine the dead. And don't forget the obligatory black attire. Everyone would wear their shiniest mourning gear, as if the lack of colour would somehow overshadow the sombre nature of the occasion. Funeral services also had a unique social hierarchy. The sway of each role came with specific price tags attached. At the top of the chain were the elite, accompanied by expensive professional mourners. Imagine hiring someone to wail theatrically on your behalf, both to showcase your status and ensure that no tear went unshed. If you didn't have access to credible sob stories, it was essential to hire someone who could convince the onlookers that they were the most sorrowful of your social acquaintances. "Look at them cry," the attendees would whisper. Clearly they knew the deceased well, much better than you did. And just when you thought it couldn't get more competitive, the full procession of mourners arrived, all dressed in black frocks and veils, forming a living cloud of grief that floated towards the church. Speaking of the church, the venue choices were as diverse as the fees. Some families could afford the luxury of a church service, while others had to settle for an outdoor grave. And depending on how close you were to the deceased, your seat could be on the front row or much further back, where you'd shuffle in awkwardly, silently praying that your late aunt's dignity wasn't in question. Contrast that with the elite, where the service was practically a Broadway production. The vicar would arrive in a frock coat worthy of Queen Victoria's approval, or perhaps with a flair for drama that would put Shakespeare to shame. As he spoke eloquently about life's transience in a tone so sombre, it made you want to crawl into that casket and take a long nap yourself. He also managed to make you feel guilty for contemplating the biscuit tray in the corner. And let's not forget the tombstone, the cherry on top of your deceased, cake. When all was said and done, the family had to decide on a fitting marker. No one wanted to be remembered by a hastily written piece of granite. You just wait until you see Aunt Beatrice's granite slab. It's just in the shape of an actual church. It's like a mausoleum for ancestors. Yes, because nothing quite says, "I loved her deeply," like a tribute that rivals the local cathedral. Burials were often attended by townsfolk, and it was considered a ghastly faux pas if there wasn't a proper turnout. If Aunt Beatrice didn't elicit an entourage at her funeral, families would whisper at the pub for decades, claiming she must have crossed a few folks, or worse yet, perhaps her mourning clothes weren't dark enough. Imagine your afterlife being just endless gossip. To put it bluntly, the cost of wrapping up a life in Victorian times meant that your budget had to accommodate not just the death, but an extravagant performance of grief as well. Friends and family would be able to recount that last tragic meal, or the quote-unquote understated coffin made of walnut, gilded trim, and extra cushioning. Because truly, who could resist that? In the end, it wasn't just about remembering the deceased, it was about ensuring you were remembered as the dead person who truly saw the value of good taste. So, as you tuck into your absent Aunt Beatrice, know that you are participating in a grand tapestry of strife, style, and potentially extravagant spending. Honestly, it seems a little absurd, but then again, what's a little melodrama among friends? Let's get poetic. Victorians loved nothing more than penning ode after ode to their dearly departed. If Shakespeare had written exclusively for sad funerals, he'd fit right in. If you weren't busy mourning, you were crafting a sonnet that would make the angels weep. Ah, the Victorian age. A time when death wasn't something to be whispered about in hushed tones, but rather a grand event with all the flair of an over-the-top production. Homages poured from pens like ink spilling from a tortured soul as people tried to outdo each other with lyrical expressions of loss. Picture this: a well-dressed man, adorned in black mourning attire, sitting at a desk with a quill poised over some fine stationery. "Dearly beloved," he begins, and you'd best believe that whatever follows is an eloquent roller coaster of emotions, touching on everything from the immortal love for the departed to the questionable wisdom of their final requests. It was like writing an elaborate breakup letter, but for a relationship that was undeniably final. If you'd lost Aunt Gertrude, you were writing verses worthy of an opera aria, while bemoaning the fact no one ever appreciated her outrageous knitting skills at the family gatherings. These obituaries disguised as soft, delicate poetry often turned out to be heartfelt confessions rather than mere expressions of sorrow. You could almost hear the quivering voice of a heartbroken poet whose last glimpse of Aunt Gertrude was her inexplicably large grey bun on her head as she knitted a tiny sweater for her pet goldfish, all while clutching her trusty cat Mr. Whiskers under her arm. You know, just your average Victorian day. Mourning held such a revered place in society that the act of writing about it became an art form, an entire genre, if you will. People took poetry workshops in drawing rooms, swapping their heartfelt elegies like trading cards. "Here's my latest," one would declare, presenting a plump piece of paper. "It's got a real pithy line about the soul ascending to the heavens," while the others gazed upon it reverently, as if it were an ancient script out of a lost gospel. The creative atmosphere was contagious. In these sessions there was a shared understanding that the more flowery your language, the more sincerely sad you would look at the during discussions. You needed to truly channel that angst. Imagine saying, "Oh, how I long for the days of Gertie's unrivalled green thumb," while choking back tears, not truly understanding why you were sobbing over a plant that didn't survive a single winter, but embracing the melodrama entirely. And let's not forget the notorious funeral poems. These were the big show. In fact, some poems were so over the top they came with dramatic musical scores. Men, weep no more. Women, clutch your lace handkerchiefs with fervour. Funerals became platforms for performing these poetic masterpieces. Everyone would be sitting there in their black attire, dabbing their eyes as the mourning poet took centre stage, flourishing their gaze over mourners like a maestro conducting a symphony of sorrow. But it wasn't only about personal losses. Some poets lost their entire wills to write for society. How about the one who wrote an entire praise poem to the pigeon that brought blackish grey soot to a bustling city? Yes, the author had a bit of a penchant for the absurd, but Victorian audiences ate it up. Pigeons were, after all, the real heroes of the blighted cityscape, not the people who'd spent eternity gilding cards about their sad blunders. The etiquette around these poems was just as intricate as the compositions themselves. Handing over your poem to be read aloud was akin to managing a delicate social dance. You weren't just expressing loss, you were risking public critique. "Oh, darling, a delightful stanza," someone might say, while eyeing their own draft suspiciously, thinking about how to step up their cemetery game. At the end of the day, the Victorian penchant for elegiac poetry didn't just add a touch of bitterness to their already sombre existence. It became a bonding tool, a way of sharing shared grief, and ultimately creating a sense of community around the concept of loss. So, if you ever find yourself lamenting the next time you lose a sock, take a page from Victorian etiquette. Remember, Aunt Gertrude deserves a sonnet. After all, what's a little poetic embellishment in a world of black-wrapped despair? The colour black was practically a national uniform, but layer upon layer, the more, the better. Once you committed to wearing black, you'd better be prepared for a lifetime of austere hues. Yet, who could argue how chic you looked in mourning garb? Picture yourself strolling through a foggy London street, swathed in heavy black silks that whisper sorrow while swatting away the occasional pigeon, struggling to survive in a world that clearly favoured the drearier side of life. The Victorians didn't just mourn, they did it with flair, making the tragic chic and the mundane tragically noteworthy. It's enough to make modern-day goths look like they're just dressing up for Halloween. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of those mourning regulations, shall we? Grief wasn't just felt, it was visually expressed, and it came with its own rulebook, thicker than Grandma's cookie recipe book. After the loss of a loved one, the widows and widowers, aka the grievers of the family, had to don their mourning apparel that could include an entire ensemble: dress, gloves, shawl, bonnet, and perhaps if the mood struck, a well-coordinated parasol designed to shield you from potential rain and nosy neighbours who dared to ask if you were doing okay. And heaven forbid you start showing up at social events in anything other than the approved black. It was akin to arriving at a costume party in clown shoes when everyone was dressed as elegant, ghostly spectres. Black wasn't just any colour, it was a multifaceted gem, much like your Aunt Gertrude's 15-layer fruitcake. There existed a hierarchy even in the shades. Full mourning was reserved for the first year, followed by half mourning, where you could parlay in greys or darker colours. Then there was second mourning, when you could bring out the lavender, but only if you'd correctly followed the rules of the first mourning period. Miss one and you risked scandal. Did you see dear Clara at the Hayes Ball? I swear she looked like she'd just stepped out of a mystery novel, and not in a good way. It was basically a multi-season long episode of keeping up with the mourning. The materials themselves were a testament to the lengths people went to express grief. Think thick black crepe fabric, which by the way was so stiff that it could probably stand on its own. Wearing that was like being swaddled in a wearable grave, perfect for conveying your sorrow but terrible for sneezing. You'd go for a half-hearted cough, and before you knew it, you sounded like an asthmatic ghost. But let's not overlook the accessories. Black gloves, of course, for proper etiquette, and to that point, a widow wasn't just a widow without a hat. Oh, the hats they wore. From veils that could hide the tears to towering creations that seemed to reach for the heavens. These headpieces were more dramatic than the average soap opera. Ever tried balancing one while also fending off someone attempting to share their unsolicited opinions on your grief. That's a duel in its own right. Oh, I'm sorry, Judith. My heart's too heavy. But tell me what's in season next. And what about the Victorian obsession with mourning jewellery? Forget simple necklaces. No, you needed to adorn yourself with brooches made from the hair of your dearly departed. Talk about a personal touch. Can you imagine someone wearing your hair as a memento? It's like everyone's worst nightmare turned into a fashion statement. What's that you're wearing? Oh, just a little something I threw together from Uncle John's locks. Chic, right? But let's reflect on how odd it must have been to see families emerging from the depths of their black-clad lives. 1 minute it's, oh no, father's passed. And the next they're forming a bustling crew of solemnly dressed figures roaming the streets, ensuring that everyone knew who was in mourning, and more importantly, who could flaunt their sadness best. Victorian mourning clothing wasn't merely about following orders. It was a fierce act of defiance against the mundane. After all, the more black you wore, the more you signalled to the world just how affected you were by loss. So that, dear friends, is how the black ensemble served not only as a tribute, but as a powerful way to ensure that your neighbours knew you were grieving. Because let's face it, if they didn't see you in black, did you even really grieve at all? Who needs a life coach when you have the genius of the Victorian mourning etiquette guiding your every tear? For the Victorians, tombstone fashion was a big deal. No more plain marker. You needed a monument worthy of all your lost relatives, and then some. Who says death couldn't be fabulous with an extra dose of granite? In fact, the family that grieved well grieved visually. Much like the dress code for mourners at the funeral, the gravestone had to match the occasion, black, ornate and heavy enough to deter any pesky raccoons from trying to make it their new den. Forget about budget constraints. These people were paving their way to the afterlife in style. Imagine walking through a Victorian cemetery where the gravestones are practically fighting to outdo each other like contestants on a gaudy reality show. You'd see marble monuments that could arguably be mistaken for mini-castles standing sentinel amidst the grass. Is that a grave or a trophy, you'd wonder? Spoiler alert, it unfortunately was not up for grabs. The fashion of the times dictated not only the size and placement of these tombstones, but also the intricate carvings, the choice of materials, and for heaven's sake, the poetry etched into the stone. Everyone wanted to ensure that when they kick the bucket, their loved ones had a few nice words to remember them by that wouldn't be confused for a shopping list. While many opted for the classic epitaph stating something along the lines of loving husband or devoted mother, others went for a more poetic route, a sentimental favourite. Rest in peace, here lies, insert name, who never finished their novel. At that point, it was practically saying, don't blame me, I'm resting in peace. It's those unfinished pages that will haunt you. And let's not forget the aesthetics. Often the grander the tombstone, the more weeping willows and granite cherubs you'd see marking the plot. It was as if those stone-cut angels were judging you for not thinking to be this extra while you were alive. Now, as you strolled through the gravestones admiring the craftsmanship, you must have been careful not to trip over anyone's carefully manicured lawn of grief. Each family had their custom designs, and it was as competitive as keeping up with the Kardashians with sadness. You might even overhear two elderly women comparing their respective graves while sipping tea as if the fate of their deceased loved ones rode on the size of their marble angels. Oh, Ethel, have you seen what the Thompsons did? A 6-foot-tall obelisk. It's practically a lighthouse. My George was never that kind of tall in life. But it wasn't just about size and artistic flair for the Victorians. There was utility in this tombstone preening. Based on your memorial's design, other mourners could, and did, play a game of emotional surveillance. If your headstone wasn't dressed up to snuff, you could be judged as a bad relative. Imagine this. You wander over to a neighbouring plot with an unadorned stone, less like a monument and more like a mistaken parking space, and whisper to your fellow mourners, are they resting, or are we doing the heavy lifting here? Ah yes, ghostly gossip reached a high watermark in this competitive landscape. But what makes it even funnier, yes, it bears repeating, is how if you were particularly thrifty, you might plump for a family plot. You'd be buried right on top of each other, stacked as closely as poorly organised Sunday school classes at church. The family that mourned together stayed together, literally. And let's not forget about mausoleums. These ornate mini-temples were the epitome of not just style, but ultimate spatial distinctiveness. If you didn't have a mausoleum, were you even trying? Instead of letting the earth swallow your loved ones, why not erect a mini-paradise of sadness, complete with a mini-pulpit for the neighbourhood's anointed mourners, and lentils that might have been decorative once but were now a snack for friendly squirrels? Sure, they might have been resting in peace, but they were an architectural bragging point and cry for attention for generations to come. So, the next time you gaze upon a well-done gravestone, perhaps while dodging a selfie competitor, you'll recognise the artistry, the pride, and the sheer cheekiness behind these eternal reminders that yes, even death has its status symbols. Life truly was one giant competition, and ultimately no one was prepared to outdo a Victorian fresh out of mourning. Visiting loved ones' graves became a grand outdoor activity. Families would pack lunches, don their blackest attire, and stroll through gravestones as easily as you would for a Sunday picnic. Just remember, slightly less cheese and crackers, more flowers and weeping. In this peculiar Victorian social event, it was all about maintaining appearances, all wrapped up in layers of black crepe fabric that could suffocate a small family if you weren't careful. It's like a fashion show, but the theme was, quite literally, what not to wear when Aunt Gladys is watching from the afterlife. Picture this, a perfectly preserved graveyard, complete with ornate headstones and the smell of fresh flowers, trying to overcome the stench of relentless decay. Is it a sign of love, or just a practical way to prevent the neighbours from asking too many questions about why you haven't been to the grave in a month? Spoiler alert, it's both. Families would gather among the memorials, clutching black umbrellas as if they might at any moment be swept away by a gust of sorrow-laden wind. That's right. Nothing says committed to mourning quite like holding an umbrella over your graveside salad to protect it from tears and rain. Children, with their naturally curious minds, would be dragged along, grumbling about being forced to admit their deepest fears at the nearest ghost-infested monument. Do we have to go see Mr. Thompson's grave? He was boring. He always smelled like cabbage. Not wanting to lose their precious lunchtime, parents responded with a stern, "Don't you dare disturb the spectral peace," because clearly the ghost of Mr. Thompson takes a personal interest in one child's opinion of cabbage. In the Victorian era, open mourning was more than an activity, it was a performance art. Each family performed its grief for anyone and everyone wandering through the cemetery. The more tears shed, the better. Mourners would take turns kneeling by graves, laying down flowers like confetti at a carnival, if carnivals featured only frowning clowns and the occasional casket. Troublesome children, well, they received stern looks aimed more at the child than at the grave. Stifling this giggly chaos became an epic endeavour, as everyone around you knew. One laugh could lead to a ghostly uprising, a truly terrifying social faux pas. In this sombre spectacle, one could always find a bit of drama unfolding. A widow might faint dramatically by a particularly grand headstone, leading to a hushed commotion as people rushed to fetch a softly spoken physician who may or may not have been drunk from too many medicinal spirits. Next came the unease of wondering how many more women fainted at grave sites because the rumour around town flew with the speed of a parched crow, and surely that would have made a great gossip point. But who needs reality when you have the chance to regale friends with tales of the great morning outing of '84? Perhaps a wildly exaggerated story about how Cousin Anne mistook a grumpy old forget-me-not for a long-lost relative. Why, I saw the way she clutched that flower. It was like she was trying to cradle a baby ghost. And then there's the crucial matter of what snacks to bring. Oh, Martha, did you hear? The Pembertons brought lemon cakes on their last visit to the cemetery. Because nothing compliments tears quite like a slice of citrus-infused confection, don't you agree? Families debated the merits of grave snacks like they were picking wine pairings for the Queen's banquet. I'll have none of those sticky buns. Those led only to scandalous delight while paying tribute to dear departed Uncle Clarence. Finally, after the grand affair of emotional theatrics was done, families would meander back to their carriage, incidentally leaving behind half-eaten bits of bread and wilted flowers scattered like little mini-monuments of their time together. A bit of history for the ghouls to gossip about during their after-dinner hauntings. After all, even the dead deserve a front-row seat at the absurdity of life as it unfolds. So while other folks may find joy in more conventional outings, perhaps a trip to the market or a raucous evening at the theatre, the Victorian elite turned grave visits into social events that blurred the lines between mourning and merriment. Just remember, what they lacked in modern-day cheer, they made up for in black-wrapped revelry. Because in the end, nothing said family gathering, quite like connecting over shared loss amidst the solemn beauty of the gravestones. Nothing said Victorian wealth and status like a mourning coach. It was the limousine of its time. Glistening black, these super trendy vehicles screamed, "Look at me! I'm deeply sorrowful and fabulously affluent." Picture this scene. You're standing on a cobbled street, watching as a polished coach with ebony wheels rolls past, drawn by a team of well-groomed horses who are also dressed in black. You can practically hear the gossip swirling among the onlookers. Oh, look, there goes Lady Wistful. She must be mourning someone terribly important if she went all out to hire such an extravagant ride. But it wasn't just about making a grand entrance. It was about driving home the point that death had to be just as luxurious as life. These coaches were decorated with elegant ornamentation, which ranged from baroque carvings to window drapes that resembled funereal lace. Just imagine being snugly cocooned in plush velvet seating, surrounded by black crepe and satin, headed for a cemetery to lower Uncle Albert, who may or may not have been your favourite, because pro tip, you never let them know who you like best when they're alive. The act of utilising a mourning coach fell squarely into a spectrum of social customs. Think about it for a moment. If you showed up to a funeral in a lacklustre buggy, you risked being the talk of the town, not for your grief, but for your questionable choice in transportation. The underlying message, if you're not grieving in style, are you really grieving at all? The Victorian zeitgeist certainly left no room for such shenanigans. Wealthy families employed the finest coaches available, complete with special compartments specifically designed to hold the casket, as if Uncle Albert himself were simply taking a stylish road trip rather than a permanent detour into the afterlife. And those who couldn't afford a personal mourning coach certainly had options. You could rent one, because what's a little extra sadness if you can look fabulous while you're at it? After all, pouting in the family parlour with a tarnished umbrella just can't compare to being paraded around town in a fancy black carriage. Let's not forget the traditions that envelop the mourning coach, like a cosy blanket of sadness. If you happened to be travelling to the funeral in one of these majestic creations, it was customary for the driver to wear, surprise, black. The horses? You guessed it, dressed in black plumes for a truly sleek effect. The entire ensemble conveyed a message clearer than the cliché: you can't make this up. Yes, I'm mourning, but take a look at my impeccable taste. When the funeral was over, there was still business to attend to. Oh, you thought it ended at the cemetery? Think again. The mourning coach still had a role to play on the way back. Everyone knew you couldn't just cruise back home staying miserable. This was the time when you had to air the grievances of deceased aunt Gertrude and make sure everyone knew what you were eating at the wake. Old gossip dies hard, just like people, so why not keep it rolling along in your classy, sorrowful carriage? And let's talk about those rather awkward social situations that unfolded during the journey. You're in a carriage full of grieving friends and family, and suddenly Aunt Maud unwittingly brings up poor Frederica's unfortunate tendency to knit sad little jumpers for deceased pets. You're forced to suppress a chuckle, which surfaces as a snort thanks to the overwhelming awkwardness. And let's face it, who doesn't let out a bemused snort at times like that? Deep sorrow, they'd all say, and yet you're left searching for the nearest exit. Just like the horses on the mourning coach wish they could toss their drivers aside and trot away into the sunset. If only there had been a proper etiquette book for such occasions, detailing how to navigate these emotional minefields while still maintaining face. Unfortunately, all they had were grim sayings such as, "It is better to look good mourning than to whine about your misery." So, there you were, elegantly sinking into upholstered seats, while trying not to laugh at Grandma's tendency to bring up the inappropriate in the most solemn of occasions. In summary, the role of the mourning coach was not merely about transportation. It was an elaborate social tool, a vehicle of prestige that carried much more than just the deceased. It steered the narrative of grief while making the road to the afterlife a tad more stylish, dripping with high society's ostentation. Because in the Victorian world, being grieving encompassed more than sad motions, it demanded a competitive flair, and your set of wheels better reflect it. Losing someone begins to feel like the latest social calendar for the Victorians. They distributed memorial cards as if sending invites to the hottest parties. Join us in mourning, it's going to be all the rage. These cards, known as death notices, were a way to let friends and family know that someone had kicked the bucket, but they were crafted with the same care and panache as the finest calling cards. Who knew death could come with such flair? Imagine getting together for tea and biscuits, only to scroll through your to mourn list alongside your to do. Want to RSVP? Better get there before they shuffle off for good. Picture this. You're casually chatting with your neighbour when she nonchalantly pulls out a stack of memorial cards like she's about to book a trip for brunch. "Oh, this one's from the Abernathys. Such a lovely family. They lost old Mr. Abernathy, such a distinguished fellow. Let's see, that was last Tuesday. Shall we attend?" Sure, why not? Nothing like balancing a scone while contemplating the finer points of mourning etiquette over dead relatives. In a time when social status was determined by how deep your frock was, it was a veritable fashion show of despair. The wording on these cards could have been poetic, a blend of sorrow and subtle bragging rights that only the Victorians could master. They weren't just notifications of loss, they were artistic proclamations that read like bittersweet poetry. "In loving memory of our dearly departed cousin, who expired while taking his afternoon nap." Such eloquence! As if a nap could have ever been a grand allusion to shuttered consciousness. Honestly, it was the equivalent of sending your RSVP without having to deal with the small talk of friendly pleasantries. Because, let's be real, nothing says, "Don't bother me," quite like a black-edged card. But the beauty didn't end with mere invitations. Memorial cards came adorned with sombre illustrations, often featuring weeping willows, because what's more uplifting than a tree sobbing over your misfortune? And delicate crosses, softly urging you to join the grieving festivity. When hearts turned heavy, you'd find floral motifs sprinkled onto the stark black designs, reminding us all that life continued, even during death's grand intermission. When you received a memorial card in the mail, you were expected to respond in kind, and that could get complicated. What do you write back to woodland creatures from the great beyond? My condolences on Mr. Abernathy's departure. Let's remember him while sipping on Earl Grey, shall we? But of course, the classic response was to write a gracefully sombre note, dutifully preserving your social grace while trying not to sound too enthusiastic about the bitter brew often served. Let's not forget about the event of the funeral itself. Attending a funeral was practically a sport, with everyone showing up in the most elaborate black attire imaginable. You'd arrive clutching your memorial card like a contestant on a game show, because only the most stylish mourners could best represent their dearly departed. Duty's rules say I can wear navy and grey next month. Let's see if I can outshine my neighbour in frocks. It gets better. These memorial cards weren't simply tossed into a drawer like your last attempted Pinterest project. Nope. They were displayed on the mantelpiece or hung on a string, like macabre holiday decorations. Suddenly your living room became a shrine to your deceased loved ones, complete with cards inviting guests to take a moment and reflect on each loss. Post-mortem pride took many forms, and everyone had their own unique way of saying, "Grief chic is officially in style." And since we love a good seasonal theme, don't think the practice stopped at the deceased. Victorians enjoyed host gatherings for good reasons. Sure, they would chat about loss, but they'd also mingle in their darkest attire, sharing recipes and choosing which funeral home would get the most custom. Let's be real. Where else could you celebrate someone's memory over tea and biscuits? The Victorian memorial card, the perfect marriage of mourning and merriment, forever etched a place in history where the living and the dead sat at the same table, enjoying the tales of those who had departed into the great beyond. And so, the next time you're raising your teacup to your neighbour's card, remember this. Victorians might have been morbid, but they understood how to turn grief into an art form that could inspire galas filled with shared sorrow. Because in the world of the dearly departed, why choose between mourning solemnity and festive cheer when you can give a funeral party that chic twist? After all, grief suits have never been out of style. Claiming your spot in the afterlife? Expect to pay premium prices. Mausoleums became the biggest symbols of social status. Think of it as a personal crumbling luxury high-rise, and you were its happiest, albeit deceased tenant. But before you start dreaming about your marble suite overlooking the eternal horizon, let's unwrap the glitz and grime behind Victorian mausoleums, where cherubs cry and the only guests allowed are the very, very dead. Imagine this. You've just kicked the bucket and your family is elbowing each other in the ribs over who gets to pick the mausoleum. The competition is fierce. It's like a game of Monopoly, except the properties are cold, stone structures that last an eternity, and the price tag could make you wish you were staying at the budget hotel of eternal rest. You'd need to haggle harder than a reluctant merchant at a flea market. Oh, you think a mausoleum is pricey? You clearly haven't been shopping for funeral plots. This one's on the outskirts. Perfect for ghosts that don't mind some traffic noise from the highway. The allure of mausoleums could make an entire family go through remarkable financial acrobatics to secure a high-end resting place. Some folks went broke trying to keep up with the Smiths' granite mini palace. Darling, they carved eternal rest in gold leaf. We can't let them outshine us. An unadorned plot is simply preposterous. The competition didn't stop in life. It followed them straight to the grave, where one-ups could be delivered with every whisper of wind through the cemetery. And the extravagance didn't stop at the construction fees. You had to consider the amenities. Some mausoleums offered lavish interiors, complete with cosy benches for the grieving, candle holders, and decorative urns. Yes, call it what you want, but it's basically a stone-clad lounge where your great-grandma can watch over the graves of her descendants while catching some semblance of comfort in her eternal rest. Oh, Martha, I'm so sorry for your loss. But have you seen my new mausoleum? It's got an exquisite chandelier. It really brings out the, eternal aesthetic. Victorian-era families took pride in their mausoleums, hiring the best architects and artisans to ensure their in-death accommodations were an artistic success. Artists adorned the resting places with intricate carvings, the ghosts of your ancestors rivaling the grandeur of any cathedral. Labouring with mitre saws and chisels, artisans created sculptures of weeping angels and winged cherubs, all as if to say, your eternal rest casually comes with aesthetics worthy of a masterpiece. Step right up, laugh your worries away, because you're comfortably trapped in an art gallery of bone. Want to know something even funnier? The more ornate the mausoleum, the higher the social standing in life. It was like the VIP section of the graveyard where only the upper echelon were allowed in. If your resting place was a simple tombstone, we're talking about the community's joke. Oh, Jerry was too proud to splurge. He's resting in simplicity, while I have a personal cloud of incense dispensed nightly in my Italian marble vault. Good luck keeping the moths out of that basic slab, and heaven forbid your family went too far. You could end up like the notorious Kurd family, whose mausoleum was deemed inappropriately flashy for the neighbourhood, leading to whispers and rumbles about their supposed bad taste even in death. They could practically hear it, sitting in their lavishly sculpted chamber while the other residents murmured about ostentation. Why can't they have just a modest little mausoleum? But no, they had to add the peacock, just because they think they're the reigning monarchs of the afterlife. In conclusion, if you thought arranging your casket was the most stressful part of dying, think again. The mausoleum fever that swept through Victorian society transformed death into a high-stakes game of status, competition, and ultimately eternal aesthetics. With each finger wiggled towards the grave, mourners weren't only laying their loved ones to rest. They were cementing their own place in an endlessly expanding hierarchy of who's who in the world of the deceased. So next time you stroll past a cemetery, take a moment to appreciate the wealth and artistry of the mighty mausoleum. You might just find that even in death the vanity was alive and kicking. Vixium could be remixed into songs, making dead relative songs the hottest genre around. Not a single tear stayed unshed, as weepy tunes filled the air during sad family gatherings. If you weren't crying, you weren't doing it right. Imagine getting together for tea, biscuits, and a good old weep over Aunt Gertrude's recent demise, all while belting out a song that could make even the heartiest of souls sob into their crumpets. If a modern-day karaoke party has you singing Sweet Caroline, Victorian gatherings had you crooning Danny Boy, while keeping a handkerchief handy for the inevitable drama. Picture it. The family matriarch softly strumming a harp in the corner, setting the mood for a lamentation concert worthy of a Broadway show, minus the glitz and glamour entirely. Instead of choreographed dance numbers, think morose ballads that exploit human tragedy, with the emotional depth of an overflowing well of tears. These songs frequently featured heartfelt lines like, "Oh, how will I live without you, dear?" punctuated by the occasional dramatic swoon of a distraught cousin who just can't take it anymore. They certainly knew how to keep it real. Now, let's face it, the Victorians had an affinity for harnessing the worst of human emotions and dressing them up in frilly manners that would rival a ball at Buckingham Palace. Funerals weren't mere events, they were theatrical productions. And the music? Well, that was the soundtrack of sorrow. As you gathered around in your very best mourning attire, your blackest fit, draped in velvet as you stared longingly at your family portrait of deceased relatives, you'd find yourself enveloped in an auditory embrace of sorrow-soaked harmonies. Death was certainly a thing to be experienced, and music was just one of the ways to air one's woes. What's crazier than the sorrowful ballads was how fond the Victorians were of performing these melodies in public. In fact, some neighbourhoods would have regular mourning song sing-alongs, because nothing brings a community together quite like shared grief. Just imagine the scene. Men in top hats and women in petticoats, clustered together, wailing in unison long after the sun set. "Oh, what a pity," they would cry in perfect harmony, triggering an avalanche of tears that could make any modern soap opera look like a light-hearted rom-com. And if you weren't inspiring tears, well, you might be the subject of much judgment and tisking, because heaven forbid you show a glimmer of joy when Aunt Mabel just kicked the bucket. The lyrics of these melancholic masterpieces were often filled with stunningly poetic lines, like how the weeping willow weeps for my sorrows, poignantly reminding everyone that even trees understand the plight of human suffering. Did someone say deep? The Victorians certainly did, and it was with a flourish. Emotional artistry had reached new heights, as every lost loved one had corresponding, dirges that were practically anthems for the heartbroken folk of the era. Every ballad was a carefully crafted lament that paraded the depth of love, loss, and the occasional slapstick humour of facing life without good old Uncle Ted around. Of course, when the day was done and all the tears had been shed, that melancholic refrain didn't just float off into the ether, it became a societal commodity. Many aspiring Victorian songwriters made a lucrative living composing new, dead relative songs, earning enough to buy extra black fabric for their own mourning attire. You could even purchase collections of the latest ballads, marketed as essential reading for anyone looking to cultivate the ultimate melancholic atmosphere during tea time with guests whom you desperately needed to impress. And so, as you down your third cup of chamomile and dry your eyes with a lace-edged handkerchief, you can almost hear the echoes of a shadowy Victorian gathering, cloaked in black and gripping their cups while echoing phrases about long-lost lovers and the eternal embrace of the grave. There's an undeniable charm in those heart-wrenching melodies. After all, who doesn't want the ultimate proof that they loved fiercely, regretting loss until the very last note? So, next time you feel the urge to belt out a tune, remember the Victorians. They weren't just crying. They were celebrating the art of grief with melodies that made even the toughest of hearts turn tender. Not going on Facebook, don't worry. The community knew who bid farewell via the daily newspaper. These notices turned into mini obituaries, so jump on the sad wagon and get ready to broadcast your misfortunate friends to the world. Yes, in Victorian times, death notices were the Instagram posts of the afterlife, allowing the grieving to not only share their loss, but also to modestly flaunt their connection with the dearly departed. Nothing says, "I knew Aunt Edna well," quite like a beautifully crafted obit tucked halfway through the local paper, following the profit margins of the mill and the livestock auctions. As you leaf through the pages, you might not just stumble upon grieving friends, but some real gems buried in the fine print. You see, the format was impeccable, typically a paragraph filled with flowery language that would put even the best of Shakespeare to shame. But let's break this down. Would it be too much if Aunt Edna received a character development arc in her obituary? Imagine heartfelt statements like, "Aunt Edna, beloved butter churner and cat whisperer, met her demise while attempting to outsmart her 5th attempts at a green thumb. I mean, who knew gardening could be so perilous?" Of course, it wasn't all about loving tributes and family lore. A little gossip added spice. Between the melodrama of mourning and reminders to wear appropriate black attire, these death notices also hinted at social standing. It was practically a social media ranking system in disguise. Consider it the Victorian who's who of the dead. Oh, the pressure! The entire community observed and noted who garnered the most likes, condolences, over others. If rich Mr. Kensington passed on, your notice was a display of how well you knew him, while the status of Mrs. Green's demise, though heartfelt, could be significantly less glamorous due to her less than glamorous background. Ever try squeezing sentiments into a measly few lines? Yeah, not easy. Writers had a knack for showcasing the deceased's accomplishments, from garden trophies to dog shows, in an infinitesimally small space. You might think they became professional obituarists overnight, but no. They were just folks trying to recapture the essence of someone's entire life in 100 words or less, with possibly more embellishment than a Victorian wedding cake. As they say, the pen is mightier, especially when spinning tales of extravagance while your beloved just passed away last Tuesday. Post-death social sharing went far beyond what mere letters or face-to-face conversation could yield. Your family's story wouldn't die in obscurity. The newspaper became an eternal vessel, a stone tablet tailored for the future. Forget waiting to hear your name during a family roast on Thanksgiving. You announce your personal tragedies while your relatives quibble over gluten-free bread at the dinner table. When others see that glossy, ink-splattered piece, they give a nod, of understanding. They might know the pain of loss. After all, it's a very exclusive club. You can't join without an obituary or at the very least a serious pep talk from the afterlife. However, the just past life is not the only subject of fascination. The living members of these grief-filled wails were also analysed. Attention shifted to who's still left standing after the tragedy, who's mourning, who's becoming a recluse out of self-pity, and who might just be deviously plotting to navigate the social hierarchy post-mortem. Quickly, death notices turned into more than a memorial. They were the go-to place for gossip while simultaneously high drama. Browsing your obituary meant picking up a pamphlet filled with the latest rumours, dodged complications and social buzz. So, let's be honest, catching up on mourning wasn't just emotional. It was a glorious opportunity to gather some dirt on your neighbours and their pets. But now, imagine the fine print. Mortuary run-ins could lead to misunderstandings as easily as they could secure friendships, all while the neighbourhood held its breath. Wait, did he just say that Uncle Harold didn't pass away from too many pickled beets? Now, that's a plot twist, like a soap opera unfolding in the local rag. So here's to death notices, your guide to eternal status updates while navigating the societal expectations of mourning. In Victorian society, the final farewell was less about sadness and more about societal standing, all printed in dim lighting like the memories of those you lost. Think of it as a love letter to the dearly departed, but slightly less poetic and infinitely more public. At the end of the day, while the ink smudged on newsprint, the loss never faded. Instead, it simply became an ongoing dialogue, forever immortalised in the community gossip cycle. Who needs Facebook likes when you have the obituary page? In the absence of Netflix, people hosted grief parties. Yes, that's a thing. You'd get together, slip into your best mourning attire and share your finest death stories, complete with laughter between sobs over cucumber sandwiches. Imagine a gathering where the conversation flows as easily as the tears, each guest dressed to the nines in black crepe, quietly assessing one another's levels of sorrow, all while taking a polite sip of weak tea. It's like a potluck for despair. As you gather in a meticulously arranged parlour, think dark wood, heavy drapes, and just a hint of musty air, you quickly learn that properly expressing your grief is the name of the game. Does your neighbour still weep for her parakeet, Mr. Fluff? Oh, of course. A fine excuse for a gathering. In fact, the more elaborate your mourning history, the more invitations you're likely to receive. You best prepare your own anecdotes about the losses you've experienced. Have you equipped yourself with the right number of tragic stories to rival Aunt Maud's tale of her deceased husband, leaving her an ungrateful statue of gloom by the piano? Because Aunt Maud has a way of making even the most mundane causes of death sound like a Shakespearean tragedy. He slipped on a banana peel while dusting the attic. God rest his soul. There's a whole symphony of grief here, and you better be ready to play your part. Oh, and let's not forget the food. Grief parties aren't all glum. They take the send your condolences concept and give it a culinary twist. Finger sandwiches, of course, because tear-stained faces and slathered butter don't mix. Here, dear, would you like to drown your sorrows in a few butter-laden appraisals of your own misfortunes? You'll nibble delicately, contemplating the many flavours of regret while the room echoes with dry chuckles about how dear Cousin Harold met his untimely end in that lawnmower accident. It's tragic and oddly comforting, like comfort food for your soul. And then there's the centrepiece, a lush arrangement of mourning flowers, of course. You know, the type of flowers no one actually wants on a sunny day. It's as if someone raided the graveyard and brought the whole of it back to the soiree. No daisies or sunflowers here, only the prettiest perennials of despair, each bloom a tribute to the dead and a solemn reminder of the guest list due to expand. The challenge? Keeping a straight face while discussing embalming techniques over a slice of ghostly white wedding cake that tastes suspiciously of sherry. But on to the guests. Each one is a magnificent character in their own right. You have the over-explaining widow, who could make a 2-minute lamentation last 30, and the cousin who always insists that the deceased was actually a war hero, even if they were just a local librarian. You exchange knowing glances with the others, silent agreements based on the shared camaraderie of the whole absurd experience. And let's consider the decor. Cobwebs are practically mandatory, hung just so, as if each strand signifies a sacred space for grief. Family portraits draped in cloth. Creepy or touching? You decide. Overhead lamps cast a dim glow that both romanticises and mortifies the entire ordeal. Who knew that death could come with such an aesthetic? As the evening winds down, arrangements are made for the next gathering, because each good Victorian knows that if you don't gather your grieving friends regularly, they may mistake you for someone less committed to remembering the dead. So, plans for a brunch the next month quickly morph into conversations about fresh urban legends. What better way to ponder life than recounting tales of spectral sightings at the graveyard? When the guests finally stroll out, still dripping in their ceremonial garb, you might think that all the laughter and dry sandwiches would lift spirits. But not in this realm. Here, the collective melancholy hovers like the scent of burnt toast, right until the next gathering. So, there you have it. A Victorian grief party where the sadness is palpable, the company supportive, and the cucumber sandwiches oddly tasty. After all, there's no shame in mourning with flair, and the better you understand the art of grief, the more prominent you become in the archival tales of this terribly morose but strangely comforting society. No one was safe from mourning. Pets got their share of stylish send-offs too. You could cherish Fluffy forever by draping them in sable and placing them in their very own casket. Because who said even pets couldn't join the club? In Victorian times, pets were not just cuddly companions, they were members of the family, filling roles ranging from affectionate confidant to the occasional emotional support animal. Though granted, they weren't quite as internet savvy as today's therapy dogs. Let's imagine the scene. You wake up to the gentle thump of a furry body hurling itself off the bed, a total slapstick routine as your dedicated dog attempts to leap before its legs have fully woken up. But alas, a few moments later, bam! Your dear four-legged friend has succumbed to the great dog park in the sky. Enter Victorian mourning etiquette with all the drama and flair of a stage play. You crumple into a pile of black lace while neighbours peek through their curtains. Eyes are rolling because, really, how many dead pets does one household need to mourn? Let's take Fido's send-off to the next level, shall we? First, the casket. It wasn't just a cardboard box with Cujo scrawled on the side. No, that would be far too grim. Picture an intricately carved mahogany coffin, complete with velvet lining, flowers neatly arranged, and a tiny plaque that reads, "Here lies Sir Barkington, noble steed of the couch." Voila! The centrepiece of the funeral. And speaking of flowers, the Victorians had a specific language for flora. That floral arrangement adorning Sir Barkington's coffin was as full of meaning as it was pretty. The lovely orchids signified beauty, while the dark lilies screamed, "I am death!" And who doesn't want a dramatic flower arrangement conveying a complex message to their neighbours during a death of dignity? It was like sending a scented postcard saying, "Come for the sad vibes, stay for the fresh-cut sorrow." As friends and family gathered, national mourning attire transformed into animal commemorations. Dress code: fancy black frocks for the humans who dutifully showed up to console you, because heaven forbid someone show up in a vibrant red dress when you are surrounded by grief. It's just not done. Then, of course, came the pet owners decked out in all black, looking sombre and stylish, even if they felt like they were trapped in a sitcom about the morbidly fashionable. At the peak of the ceremony, there'd be eulogies, a series of speeches that hugged the border of ludicrous and heartfelt. Grandma might recount how Sir Barkington wagged his tail like a true gentleman on ice, backing a brilliant career of fetching sticks and sneaking bits of cake from unsuspecting toddlers. It was a life well lived. He was a martyr against the tyrannies of the vacuum cleaner, someone might lament, with a dramatic flair befitting a Shakespearean actor, while the poor dog probably spent its whole life wondering why you could only eat cake from the side table. Let's not forget memorial cards. These lovely luncheons could add yet another layer of glam. Victorians etched details about the pet alongside a striking portrait, just in case someone forgot what Fido looked like when you casually mentioned him 5 years later. Please remember, my darling Sir Barkington, the best couch ornament and amateur stick enthusiast is resting peacefully beyond the Rainbow Bridge, they would say, asking all attendees to take a moment to appreciate the fine art of dog-directed portraiture. But let's wrap up the ceremony with a final act of genius: burial rites that rival those of elites. Many Victorians had pet cemeteries of unimaginable grandeur. Your average family pet could secure a plot right next to the neighbourhood's most esteemed ancestors. Only the best for your beloved companion. And who knew that laying a dog to rest could involve such a fine line between love and absurdity? With a little pomp added to the serious business of loss, you'd ensure that Sir Barkington would sit at a fine, phantasmagorical family banquet table even in death, albeit with a silver dish for a collar. So, here's to the creatures of mourning, the ones that brought love and laughter into our lives only to leave us scratching our heads, quietly sniffing under the guise of dignity. It's a pet's tale wrapped in love, abundant, poignant, and properly suited for Victorian mourning rituals that award unique ways to cherish the bonds we forged, even if one of those connections involved a whimsical goodbye of ornate caskets dripping in theatrical tragedy. Who knew mourning could be such a fashionable affair?